He is widely recognized. He is widely recognized for his scholarly contribution, which blend rigorous theoretical insights with practical policy recommendations, particularly in the context of India and other developing economies. Professor Panagariya's pioneering research in trade theory includes his analysis of comparative advantage, trade liberalization, and the impact of globalization on developing countries. His studies have provided nuanced perspectives on how open trade policies can drive economic growth and reduce poverty. He has written extensively on regional trade agreements, multilateral trade negotiations, and the implications of trade policies for labor, poverty reduction, and welfare. Professor Panagariya's contribution to India's economic reform process and his insights into the country's growth trajectory are very well known. His landmark book, India, the Emerging Giant, provide an in-depth analysis of the economic policies that have shaped India's rise as a global economic power. He has been a strong proponent of economic reforms, emphasizing the need for free trade, labor market flexibility, infrastructure development, and industrialization to sustain high growth rates and generate employment. As a former vice chairman of the Niti Aayog, he played a major role in shaping India's development agenda. During his tenure, he advocated policies to promote inclusive growth, improve investment climate, and attract foreign investment. His contributions were instrumental in fostering a dialogue on structural reforms, healthcare, education, and social welfare. And on a personal note, I've been a direct beneficiary of Professor Panagariya's scholarly contributions. His groundbreaking work, particularly in the fields of international trade and on Indian economy, has profoundly influenced my own research and thinking. His work has been so foundational to the field of international trade and to my own research that I cannot recall writing anything without citing him. Sir, welcome again, and I invite you to deliver the lecture. Thank you. Yes, yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, before the lecture, there's a award ceremony, so we thought that we will do first. Yeah.
Now we move on to the award ceremony. I would like to request Professor Arvind to kindly award the recipients. They'll be receiving certificates and cash prizes. First of all, we have the award for the best performing assistant professor in terms of number of publications for the biennium 2021-23. The award goes to Dr. Ritika Jain. I request Ritika ma'am to kindly come forward to receive the award. Now we have the John Robinson Prize for the academic year 2022-24. It is awarded for the best overall performance in MA Applied Economics program. The award goes to Mr. Anandakrishnan V. I request Mr. Anandakrishnan to kindly come forward to receive the award. Now it's time for the MG Kanpur Prize, which is awarded to the best performer in the quantitative courses of the MA program for the academic year 2022-24. It's jointly shared by Ms. Anusmita Das and Ms. Rini Raju. Ms. Rini is here. Let's give her a huge round of applause. Ms. Anusmita couldn't make it. Her certificate will be displayed on the screen. Now we move on to the A.D. Neelakandan Endowment Prize, which is awarded for securing the highest grade point average in the PhD coursework. It goes to Mr. Kalayak Mohammad Shamil from PhD batch 2022. He won't be able to join us today. He's joining us online and his certificate is displayed. Thank you, Professor Arvind, for honoring the awardees, and congratulations to all the award winners. And now there's a special announcement. Ms. Ponnu Bimal has secured the MG Kanpur Prize for the best performance in the quantitative prizes of MA program 2023-25. Congratulations to Ms. Ponnu, and the award will be distributed in the next Foundation Day lecture. Now I request Professor Arvind to kindly deliver the lecture.
Thank you, Professor Veeramani, Dr. Jayatilak, faculty, students, and everybody else. I'm deeply honored to be delivering this Foundation Day lecture. Dr. K.N. Raj was an iconic figure, when I was a student. He was someone who was up there. Later, I learned that he was also a key author of the first five-year plan, which was extremely well written. And of course, numerous of his writings are there for everyone to see. He was truly a major figure. And later on, I think he went on to be the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University as well. And I heard stories about him from my mentor and good friend, Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, and of course, Professor Bhagwati is also my co-author on a number of things. So today's lecture is about the Nehru development model. Now, just to clarify here, what is it? It's going to move or not? Shall we try? Next. Okay. So it is this last one, last key. Okay, now it's working. So okay, so it's great. So just to clarify, the book has two different publishers in India. This has been published by Penguin under the title "The Nehru Development Model: History and Its Lasting Impact." And outside of the Indian subcontinent, it's published by the Oxford University Press, New York, under the title "The Nehru Era Economic History and Thought and Their Lasting Impact." So that's title and cover page are different, but otherwise it's the same book. So that's just for clarification. Okay, there are a few things I may draw upon from the presentation, but largely I'm going to speak in plain English. There are perhaps at one place there is a quotation I want to bring out, and that's where I might use the PowerPoint presentation. The book has three parts. One is about the history of thought, really, how Nehru's own thought evolved, and what was the thinking of the major figures from academia, political field, bureaucracy, etc., during that era and subsequently as well. Then there is a second part which is about the economic history, which is about how the Nehru development model itself unfolded. And then the third part is about the lasting impact, what happened during that period of roughly, you can say either 15 or 17 years. Really, if you take from 1950 51, it's a 14-year period. Nehru passed away in May 1964. What happened during that period continues to impact. It had continuous impact on the economic unfolding of the policy and economy in India. And till today, it continues to impact us in ways that we may not often realize, but it does. So that's a sort of basic overview of what the book is about. Where I want to begin is that, we think of Nehru, the general perception is that Nehru went to study in England, studied at Harrow, Cambridge, and then the Inner Temple. At the Inner Temple, he did his law degree, and at Cambridge, he did his bachelor's, and Harrow was his schooling. And the general impression is that, somewhere between Cambridge and Inner Temple, he became a Fabian socialist. And that is what then ultimately unfolded in terms of what kind of economic policies India adopted. That impression actually, so as I started reading about Nehru from a more kind of research standpoint, I quickly found out that impression is all completely wrong. If you what turns out is that when Nehru returned from England after his studies, I think maybe around 1905 or somewhere thereabouts, its ideas were still or 1911 maybe, but yeah, it's about 1911. His ideas on socialism had still not quite formed. It is in fact, and if you see the subsequent history, he comes back, starts doing some practice with his father, Pandit Motilal Nehru, in practicing in law, doesn't quite like it and so forth. Then first time he meets Gandhi, but nothing much comes out the first time he sees him, which was I think at an earlier Lucknow session. But 1919 or so, he begins really to get interested in the national movement, and very quickly he finds that that is his passion. But if you see the years that go on, there is not much of a trace of socialism in him. It's only when he makes a second trip to England. Europe in general, I think, and England as well, but mostly, Switzerland first, because that's where his wife Kamala Nehru was went for treatment, and that was the reason for him to go back to Europe at the time. But February 1927, there is a major conference in Belgium, which lasts for several days. And it is a conference that brings all the labor leaders and socialists, communists, and the national leaders of different countries, basically national leaders of many different colonies of the time. And this conference really is all about how the developing countries have been enslaved, and how the capitalism has led to this imperialist tendencies around the world, and resulting in the enslavement of so many different countries. Socialism was the answer to it. I think this is where his ideas form up, and then when he returns, he makes a stop in the Soviet Union. And there he is also impressed with the kind of economic successes that Soviet Union has had. And that Nehru that returns, his biographer Gopal writes, was a totally different man. This was a revolutionary. And subsequently, the speeches that Nehru delivers actually reflect this very radical socialism. This is not any kind of mild form or some sort of advocacy where capitalism kind of morphs into socialism, which is how, or within the democratic setups, you promote enough aspects of socialism to ultimately get to the true socialism, which is roughly how Fabian socialism can be described. That's not how it is actually. What he comes out after this visit to Europe and to Soviet Union is a very radical socialist. But really, at one point, he gives a press conference and says that there are only two paths before us. One is fascism, and the other is communism. And between those two, I choose the latter, meaning I choose communism. And this radical socialism, of course, continues. And this is where I just want to draw on this presentation. So here you'll see that, he later on, of course, quickly acquires seniority within the Congress, rapidly climbs up in terms of the leadership within the Congress. In 1936, he is the president of the Congress. This is a session, a Congress, AICC session that takes place in Lucknow in 1936. And this is where I want to quote from his speech, just to make the point that, this radical socialism in him is indeed what I'm describing. So he says there in that session that I see no way of ending the poverty, the vast unemployment, the degradation, and the subjection of the Indian people except through socialism. That involves vast and revolutionary changes in our political and social structure, the ending of vested interests in land and industry, as well as the feudal and autocratic Indian state system. That means the ending of private property, except in a restricted sense, and the replacement of the present profit system by a higher ideal of cooperative service. In short, it means a civilization radically different from the present capitalist order. Goes on, extolling the Soviet experience, he adds, some glimpse we can have of this new civilization in the territories of the USSR. Much has happened there which pains me greatly and with which I disagree. But I look upon that great and fascinating unfolding of a new order and a new civilization as the most promising feature of our dismal age. If the future is full of and if the future is full of hope, it is largely because of Soviet Russia and what it has done. And I'm convinced that if some world catastrophe does not intervene, this new civilization will spread to other lands and put an end to the wars and conflicts which capitalism, so I can't go. Okay, it continues. But anyway, you get the idea that basically this is a very radical socialist who very much endorses the Soviet experience and sees salvation of the subjugated countries in some sort of international socialism. So that's a point I make, just so that we understand that Nehru himself actually was a lot more radical socialist than what unfolds later on. Now, how he transitions from this radical socialism to a more moderate form of socialism, what we call Fabian socialism or mixed economy or Nehruvian socialism, if you will. Actually, even Fabian socialism is the wrong term to use. It's Nehru socialism is his own. And so I think Nehruvian socialism is perhaps a better term. How he gets to that is difficult to track down. And I sort of looked for all, in a way, a lot of what I learned about Nehru was also reading his own writings. But now, after 1936, there is no major writing by Nehru other than the discovery of India, which is writes in 1945. And some hints of what may have changed him do appear there, but they're not quite so explicit. And so in a way, since he writes so extensively earlier, one would have thought that he would somewhere explain why he changed his views on socialism, but he doesn't. So one has to read in between lines, and my interpretation of where the change happened is that around 1938, when Subhash Chandra Bose was the president of the Congress Party, appointed a national planning committee. So Bose was also very much a follower of socialism, and in this aspect, at least, Nehru's thinking and Bose's thinking was quite well aligned. So he appoints this national planning committee, to which then he asks, which he asks Nehru to chair. And the committee then brings in all the leading kind of experts from different fields, from the industry, from science, from economics, some from politics, with Nehru chairing it. And this is where there is a lot of dialogue between Nehru and the industrialists. Industrialists are seeking space for their own private entrepreneurial activity. Nehru is pushing for nationalization, socialism and nationalization. And I think this is where he writes also in The Discovery of India that through this interaction, we each learned, we did not always agree, but we did try to find a common ground, etc., etc. And I think this is where the industrialists learned about where Nehru was heading, and Nehru learned about somewhat indispensability of the industrialists. In Nehru's thinking, one thing was very clear that, to combat poverty, he needs to increase production, meaning he needs growth. And he comes to quickly realize that without the cooperation of the industrialists, he cannot really achieve the kind of growth he would need to combat India's poverty. Industrialists, on the other hand, learned that, if they have to live within Nehru's India, best they can expect is to carve out some part of the industry where private enterprise will be permitted. So I think this is where the two come together. And on the industrialist side, what we have is a Bombay Plan, which gets written in 1944-45. And on Nehru's side, eventually, it is the second 5-year plan that gets written. And if you read the second 5-year plan and the Bombay Plan of the industrialists, you will see that there's a lot of similarity between the two. They effectively argue more or less the same thing. And what that same thing is, I'm going to describe in a minute. So this is where ultimately, after independence, when the Planning Commission is appointed, Nehru begins to embark upon his development planning. The mixed economy model begins to come through. So this is the background. Now, I want to get quickly so that because I want to eventually come to today. That's my ultimate goal. So I'm going to take jumps in places, not tell you everything that is there in the book, which is virtually impossible in any case. If you're interested, then you read in the book. But the core of the arguments and core of what is there in the book is what I want to very quickly hop through. So first thing is that what is Nehru's model? What is Nehru thinking? So the main ingredients of Nehru's model are that one, he wants self-sufficiency, because he thinks that international trade ultimately is the instrument of imperialism. So if you engage in international trade, eventually it's going to lead to imperialistic tendencies, or either you will become victim of imperialism yourself, or you will develop imperialist tendencies on your side. And he says, I want neither. And so therefore, I'm not interested in international trade. We've got to be self-sufficient. So that is one of the core elements of Nehru's model, self-sufficiency. And this is here, it's not what we call today self-reliance. I mean, self-reliance to me is a very different phenomenon. Self-sufficiency here is effectively that we ultimately have to start producing what we need to consume at home. So ultimately, this is about rejigging the production basket to what our consumption basket is. Nehru is not, in a traditional sense, a protectionist or import substitution advocate. Instead, what he's talking about is that let us gradually rejig our production basket to the one that is our consumption basket. And so then we'll not have to rely on international trade. Now, this is one part of it. Second part of it is that he obviously wants to get India rid of its poverty. He refers to it as India's appalling poverty. For that, he says that, look, currently our incomes are so low, they're so low that there is really no wealth to redistribute. There is only poverty to redistribute. Again, his words, those are roughly what the words he uses, that there is not enough income or wealth to redistribute, there is only poverty to redistribute. So unless we really grow, unless we have much more income, we cannot really come out of this poverty. And some figures are there, that pre-war figures, which he cites in the discovery of India and all. Therefore, for growth, what do you need? Well, you got to invest. So the prevailing thinking is that really, later, as economic as economics also progresses, there is a lot more emphasis on efficiency of production, growth, productivity growth, that is, the growth through productivity increases. Efficiency becomes a lot more central in the thinking of economists subsequently. But around this time, really, it is the investment. Very much like, if you have read the Herod-Domar kind of model, that, capital is what is going to drive growth, because the capital to output ratio or incremental capital to output ratio is given. If you're going to grow, you need to invest. Well, then if you're going to invest, you need the machines in which to invest. So Nehru's thinking was that, look, first and foremost, what India has to be able to do is to be able to produce machines. Because if you don't produce your own machines, then you have to depend on the import of machinery. which is, of course, antithetical to him because he wants self-sufficiency. So he says, how do we get to self-sufficiency quickly? Well, let's learn how to make machines. It also kind of blends well with his strategy of, making India strong militarily. That look, ultimately, if you have this heavy industry structure in your country, then you can also produce your defense weaponry and defense equipment, etc. So this is also kind of blends well with that thinking. And so he says that we got to really focus on the development of machinery. And so this is where the whole heavy industry kind of comes to play. He wants to put up steel mills, he wants to put up machinery factories, he wants to put up chemical industries, etc. So very heavy industry. So that's central to Nehru's model. Then he says, look, where are the consumer goods going to come from? So he says, well, we got these cottage industry, these village industries, household industries. This is where all the light manufacturers will go. And these light manufacturers, or the small industry, as he would sometimes call it, or hand industry, because you're using only labor, hardly any capital. So hand industry as the source of employment as well. So here you got, you need to solve the problem of production, the problem of growth, which is going to be done through the heavy industry, and India will industrialize through this specialization in heavy industry. Employment will be in these in this small industry or hand industry. Consumer goods will also come out of there. Agriculture was a bit marginal to his thinking. It's recognized that India needed, of course, to grow its food and all. So, but he felt that this is happening anyway. There's not very much to be done. So agriculture was certainly not very central to his policies. But this is roughly how the Nehru model was configured. Now, what happens, of course, is that, just think about it, that your main factor of production that is plentifully available to you at the time is labor, right? But that is not something you're using very effectively, because what we have done in the allocation of factors is capital, which is sitting here in steel mills, machinery industry, chemicals, etc., with hardly any labor. At the other extreme, you have all labor sitting in these small industries, which has no capital. So in effect, what you have done is that worst way that you could allocate both capital and labor is how you have done that. You leave capital in one place where there is hardly much labor, and you leave labor in one place where there's hardly any capital. So obviously, this is going to lead to very low productivity, which is what did happen. But also, around this time, the world had gone on to fixed exchange rate system. And so what it also meant was that your exports might not fetch at that exchange rate enough foreign exchange to finance all the imports that people would like to bring into the country. And so naturally, import licensing followed. Now, import licensing regime, the administrative machinery had existed from the Second World War, when the British had first introduced those restrictions. But, in the early years, India had a lot of foreign exchange, which it had accumulated in terms of the sterling reserves by having significant balance of payments surpluses during the Second World War. So India's imports were very limited during that period. Exports were much larger. So a lot of sterling balances had been collected. So you could actually afford the imports more easily because you were drawing on these sterling balances. But you did not realize that, ultimately these sterling balances will run out. And then you'll need to tighten your import controls much more significantly. So import licensing was existed, but till 1957, which is around the time that this foreign exchange ran out, imports were liberally allowed. And so, if you have your grandparents to tell you the stories, they'll tell you that, my wife here is able to tells me the story of her mother that, they used to be able to import all sorts of cosmetics and whatnot, always using foreign made soaps and other cosmetics, etc. These were allowed actually around this time. But after 57, the tightening begins to happen and consumer goods imports completely kind of very quickly by early 1960s, hardly any other than the food, other than essential items for existence, hardly any consumer goods are allowed. That comes to a stop. Now, I want to step back here for a little bit of the history of economic thought, that what happens is this really second five-year plan is the time when much of this model is put into implementation. Some bit begins to happen in earlier. There is a 1948 industrial policy resolution. Then 1951, you begin to work on the first five-year plan and all. But really, it takes 2 years to bring out that plan. And by the time the plan comes in, 2 years are gone. It's only a 3-year plan effectively, and very little. But second five-year plan is the true five-year plan, which implements Nehru's model. This is where he comes in, begins to invest very heavily into steel industry and machinery industry. Here, there is virtual consensus. Now, first point, one thing to note here is that in terms of the allocation of resources, what Nehru is planning and actually does implement in the second five-year plan is the worst possible allocation. Because if you are a labor abundant country as we were, as we still are to some degree, what you want to do is start out, even if you're doing import substitution, you start out with the more labor intensive products first, right? The Koreas, Taiwans, later on China's, what they did was to, first specialize into labor intensive industries. And if for that you have to, do some little bit of import substitution, you do that. You can argue that Korea and Taiwan did that in the 50s and early 60s. And gradually, as you become richer and so forth, then eventually you get into the more labor intensive. And as you get richer, you get more capital. From labor abundance, you are moving towards greater capital abundance, and then gradually you move into more capital intensive industries. Also, when this happens in this process, labor is working with capital, so it begins to acquire skills. And as the system becomes more capital intensive, more complex machinery comes in and skill level gets upgraded. And at least my thinking is that, you acquire skills principally by working with machines, by working in the factories. You can do some skill development, etc., as we all try to do, but in the end, without that factory training, whatever you learn remains incomplete. And if there is no factory production happening to impart you skills, skill formation is not going to happen. That is precisely what happened, because all our labor force was sitting in these household industries, cottage industries, etc., where there was no capital. You're still, doing things with hand, artisan type of work. Any single entrepreneur was supplying maybe, a handful of customers. These are all tiny micro kind of what you might today call micro enterprises. That's what all of these were. Where the all capital was sitting, there were very few workers. And so in this sense, I say that this was the worst possible allocation. What you needed to do was to bring labor and capital together, where a large part of the labor force gets to work with at least some capital. That's not something that happened. Only Milton Friedman around this time, who came in 1955, or when the second five-year plan was being done, there's a very famous, it was, I think, not even noticed around that time. 1980s, it came to the notice for the first time, and now it's available everywhere. But he got it all completely right. He said that this is the wrong allocation of resources. You need to spread capital over a lot more labor than what you're doing here. And he said many other things as well, which all make very good sense to an economist. Now, what was the thinking of the leading economists at the time? Virtually every economist was with Nehru. So hardly anybody objected. So there was a panel of economists with about 21 economists on that panel, which submitted a report on the draft second five-year plan, which was written by Mahalanobis. Melanobis, largely, if you have read the Melanobis model, it really is effectively writing the Nehru model around a few equations. So in this sense, I would say that, and Melanobis had been talking to Nehru since early 1940s. So he knew his mind very well. And so the model, to me, very much is substance of it is really coming from Nehru. But what we call the Melanobis model is then a formalization of those simple ideas. And Melanobis model says that, look, if you want to maximize growth in the long run, then you need to invest in the machinery more than you invest in the consumer goods. That, in a nutshell, is the Melanobis model. So, virtual support expert B.R. Shenoy, who attached a note of dissent to this submission by the panel of economists, where he argued that, look, your plan is too big and it will require deficit financing. And given this fixed exchange rate system, that would simply mean that more money will be created. When more money is created, it is going to translate into inflation. And inflation is going to make your products uncompetitive, etc. He was quite right. But that was the main objection, that he wanted a smaller plan. Virtually nobody questioned the idea of starting with heavy industry. Nobody advocated that we ought to start with labor-intensive products first. So in this sense, there was virtual agreement with the Nehru model. And indeed, if anything, the economists in their memorandum were advocating even more controls than the plan had envisaged at the time, that the draft second five-year plan had envisaged at the time. So it sailed through, obviously, and there were a lot of foreign economists also were invited. Friedman actually was not one of them. Friedman was sent by the United States separately, but most economists who were actually invited, they all endorsed that this is the only way to do. Import substitution is a good way to go about it. Machinery production is good. Heavy industry is good. So full support at the time. And this is all documented extensively in the book, which you can look up. Now, what is the implication? What is the implication? Now, what happens is that you want a production structure which is different from what the markets, what the entrepreneurs are going to choose, right? Left to themselves, entrepreneurs are going to invest in labor-intensive industries because that's where the profitability will be. But you don't want that. You want resources to be mobilized and taken into these heavy industry sectors. What are the instruments to do that? Well, evidently, there were two instruments that were deployed. A lot of the production activity was moved into public sector. So the public sector kind of moved in a big way into production, manufacturing activity. Nehru was more pragmatic, so he did not want the private industry to disappear or anything. So he said, if they would contribute to output and production, so be good, let them do it. We will gradually expand the public sector. So we'll mobilize these resources, productive resources. Over the years, we will invest more and more in the public sector, and that's how the public sector will grow. He also took the view that we don't want to go and buy out, meaning nationalize these private industries, because he said, well, those are all old technologies. Why do we want to use our resources, meaning public resources, to invest in this old technology? We are going to develop our own new industries. We'll bring in new technologies, and in this sense, we'll establish more efficient factories rather than use up our financial resources by nationalizing the existing private industry. So he accommodated clearly the private industry, but private industry also needed to be controlled in the way that they don't invest into low priority industries, priority as determined by the government. And so this is where the investment licensing came. And finally, there's the import licensing, because you also have the problem that even if you give investment licenses, in the early years, at least, the machinery will still have to be imported. Raw materials may still have to be imported, but you don't have enough foreign exchange. And so what do? You go through the import licensing, but this import licensing, as I described earlier, was relatively liberal in the early years till 1957. By 1957, all the sterling balances that we had accumulated during the Second World War ran out. A devaluation would have been a good move at the time, but there was no appetite. There was complete agreement that devaluation is not the way to go. Again, only B.R. Shenoy kind of advocated, but Nehru rejected that idea as a fantastic nonsense. I mean, those are his words, that this is all fantastic nonsense. So it was not done. The exchange rate remained fixed where it was. And over the years, of course, that opened the way for inflation to set in and make Indian products progressively less and less competitive. And that, of course, translated into ever tightening import controls. So the import regime became progressively tighter and tighter, and by early to mid 1960s, pretty much imports fell sharply. By 1970 they were about just 4% of the GDP. So practically we were getting close to autarky, a situation of no trade. So this is where now you come to what impact all that had, and those of you and all of you actually who are very young probably do not know enough about what kind of world my generation lived through. So there are two chapters. So these were very painful chapters for me to write, chapter 6 and chapter 8. But I suggest to you that even if they're going to be painful to read, if you read the book, read those chapters carefully, you will see how difficult we made for anybody to do any business in India. I mean, even if you think that you know about controls, you will all be surprised how complicated and complex that entire system was. So chapter 6 and 8 are the main kind of ones where this description is provided. Okay, what is the impact of it? Obviously, the efficiency really very much suffered. There was no competition. As far as trade was concerned, from external side, there could be no competition because import controls were rampant. Anybody who wanted to produce anything, immediately import controls were imposed. So, anything that was being imported, you said, I'm going to produce it here. On the promise of producing it at home, you will be able to get the imports to be completely stopped. So it is basically, protection provided on demand. So foreign competition went out of it, but domestically also the government was deciding how, how many are going to be allowed to given the entry, because you're trying to allocate the resources, how much production I'm going to allow this. So planning commission is sitting there, which is deciding all the priorities, product by product, which products will be produced, how much of each product will be produced. And then there is a whole large machinery, which then gives the licenses based on the targets set by the planning commission to individual entrepreneurs, that you'll produce this much, you'll produce this much. And that, of course, kills the competition actually domestically as well. Because domestically also limited entry is permitted, and those who have gotten the import licenses basically can produce. Nobody provides a threat to them. Indeed, the successful entrepreneurs sometimes would go in, put in their applications first, get the licenses, and then even block the entry of future entrepreneurs, saying that, well, you have already given the license to me and I'm going to start production. Why are you giving more licenses? There will be too much production. So the domestic competition also got killed, and you can imagine what kind of efficiency would result. Then there were also price controls and the distribution controls, right? So some of the heavy duty consumer goods that were produced in factories, like automobiles, two-wheelers, the scooters, there's control, because you're producing very little, not enough. Demand far exceeded the supply. So you can in the market, that will lead to a very high price. So you control the price. That, of course, meant that too many people wanted the product, but not enough supply was there. So you did allocation. who is going to get the scooters, who is going to get automobiles. Somebody is going to make that decision. And so long queues started forming. I mean, these were the products which were given by first come, first served basis. An interesting joke actually from the Soviet Union on this one that, once this is a joke told by Ronald Reagan, the American president in the 1980s, saying that, look, in the Soviet Union, exactly the same system. So long queues for automobiles, there is a 10-year queue. So this fellow goes in, says, I want to buy an automobile, says, okay, deposit this much money, deposits the money, comes back, okay, so what is the next step? Well, he says, your car will be delivered in 10 years' time. So come back in 10 years. So the fellow asks, well, is this going to be in the morning or in the evening? He says, well, what does it matter? It's 10 years from now. So he said, no, actually, I have the appointment for a plumber to come on that day in the morning. So that is what the control system kind of system that controls gave rise to. And so you can look through growth. The per capita incomes during Nehru's own period grew at 2%, a little less than 2% per year. Subsequently, it got worse. Actually, under Indira Gandhi, we went even more into socialism. A lot of nationalization happened. Labor laws got tightened up. Urban Land Ceilings Act was introduced. Coal industry, insurance industry, oil industry, all these got nationalized. So much more, the control regime became much tighter. And the rest of the history, the 1991 reforms happened and all. Okay, so that's the first very quick overview. And my last piece I want to now do is what long run impact this whole thing has had. Now, what happened, however, is that during this period, 14, 15-year period when Nehru lived, socialism got really imbibed by all the major players in the system, whether it was the politicians, or it was the bureaucrats, or it was the intellectuals, or even the businessmen themselves. At least until the mid-1960s, you don't hear very much voices for liberalization, even from the businessmen. What they're asking for is that somehow administer this licensing system better. There are enormous delays. We can't get our licenses. We don't get replies. It's a very complicated system. Simplify it, etc. There are not very many voices of liberalization, actually, even from the businesses. First time, I think, mid-1960s, after Nehru. Nehru is dead, gone, and then, you begin to hear a bit from J.R.D. Tata. I think I quote him in the book somewhere, you'll see, and he is gets very upset, says, what are we doing here, and all. But he is really the single person who really speaks with conviction for liberalization and doing away with licensing, etc. But even FICCI, etc., which is the main body, today CIA is the main body, but until almost 1990, the main industry's body is FICCI. And so eventually it begins to ask for liberalization. But in a muted sort of way. Even as 1991 reforms begin to happen, none of the industry bodies are even industry bodies are asking for trade liberalization. They're happy with the dismantling of the investment licensing, but they are not really for dismantling of the import licensing. So that is the kind of thinking. Now, socialism acquires such currency through during this period that whenever there is a struggle between socialists and opponents, now I hesitate to say that socialists and non-socialists, because there are no non-socialists actually in the system as we are getting into from 60s to 70s as we are going. So it's hardcore socialists and not so socialists. So the first major struggle happens in 1969 between Mrs. Indira Gandhi and the organizational wing of the Congress party, the so-called syndicate. This is Nambudripad, Moraji Desai, Kamraj, etc., who are considered the conservatives within the Congress party, as opposed to the socialists, which is the wing that Indira Gandhi is leading. So in the first such struggle, it is a hardcore socialist which won, meaning Indira Gandhi wins out. She nationalizes the banks, which is celebrated in the streets in New Delhi. I mean, this really, she becomes incredibly popular as a result of nationalization, and her candidate ultimately for president, V.V. Giri, wins the presidency, and that basically sidelines completely the Congress syndicate. And because there is a split in the Congress, Congress O becomes the syndicate side of it, and Congress I becomes Indira Gandhi's Congress and all, and then 1970s unfold, etc. And of course, Mrs. Gandhi then, this is the time, moves very heavily into her socialist agenda of all nationalization, Urban Land Ceilings Act, Industrial Disputes Act gets tightened up dramatically and all also. Now, the second opportunity that comes in is that, after the emergency, she loses the election. Morarji Desai comes in, becomes the prime minister. Now, you think that this was Morarji Desai was the symbol of conservatism, and you would think that some dismantling would happen. None of that happened. Actually, it's for the 3 years that Morarji Desai and followed by Charan Singh very briefly are prime ministers. Nothing much happens. It's very much the same set of policies. Actually, it gets worse because he makes this small scale industries reservation even much wider. He expands the list of products that were reserved for exclusive manufacturing by the small scale manufacturers by some 300-400 such products. So that is the main thing he does. But otherwise, the system as put in place by Mrs. Gandhi remains in place. So here is again, and sort of at least, not so socialist government comes in, but it plays very much socialistically during its regime. They lose, Indira Gandhi comes back. Second time when 1980 Indira Gandhi comes in, she is perhaps a little more liberal than she had been in the earlier years, but not dramatically so. In the end, it is to Rajiv Gandhi that for the first time liberalization finds a constituency. Now, Rajiv Gandhi turned out to be a very different prime minister. Rajiv Gandhi had never been interested in politics. He had studied in England. And then about 1970, he came, joined the Delhi Flying Club, became a pilot, and he became a pilot with the Indian Airlines. He was a future politician who basically had experienced socialism from the other side as a recipient, what it did to the customers. So he was not warm to socialism. He was actually very much against socialism as it had been seen. He very much wanted to dismantle it. But again, the socialist forces within the Congress remained very strong. The even within less than a year, the senior Congress leadership completely derailed him. That he could, he had to follow Nehru's policy of socialism. Thank you. And in the end, in May 1985, so his first budget, 85-86 budget, very reformist budget. You look through that, economic surveys, etc. They describe, that came out for 85-86. Vast number of reforms he declared, which he also managed to implement. But when he sought their approval by the AICC, All India Congress Committee, in May 1985, at the All India Congress Committee session, he was completely stonewalled by the senior Congress leadership. And message was given to him that he has got to endorse socialism because that is what Nehru had taught us, and that was Congress's policy, and that was the Congress's soul. And so actually the speech he delivers, although he still doesn't give up, so he reinterprets. He said, what is after all socialism? Socialism to me is not about bringing those who are rich down to the level of those who are not rich. But to me, it means raising the living standards of the poor and bringing them to the higher standards. So he reinterprets it in a very wise sort of way. But nevertheless, he has to publicly declare his adherence to socialism. So in the end, he gets derailed, and of course, last 3 years we all know because of the Bofors and the what happened with the Shah Bano case, what happened with the army being sent to Sri Lanka, etc. Rajiv really lost his popularity very, very quickly. So in any case, he became much weaker later on. But the long and short of it is that Rajiv Gandhi truly was the first prime minister who wanted to change India, who wanted to move away from socialism, but effectively. Within his own party, he could not win that battle, and we still remained beholden to the regime that had been put in place, starting with Nehru. The first change that truly, so it is some little bit of liberalization did happen and all that we all have not written about, described, etc. Really, 1991 is the big turning point where Narasimha Rao actually does liberalize, which is a huge puzzle, actually, if you think about it. Narasimha Rao had also been nurtured and brought up during this entire period of socialist thought being the dominant thought. He was only 3 or 4 years younger to Indira Gandhi. So he was very familiar with Nehru. He was a great admirer of Nehru and all. So it's a big puzzle. Why did, how is it that Narasimha Rao actually became a liberalizing prime minister? You can explain at least the initial liberalization by saying that, well, there was no choice left, and he had to, to get the loans, to get in the flow of funds coming back into the country. He had to accept the conditions imposed or demanded by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, etc. But actually, Narasimha Rao did not stop there. In the subsequent years, he actually continued on the path to liberalization. Financial liberalization happened. Entry was given to the private players in the telecommunications industry. Then entry was also given in the airline industry to private players. Banks, private banks were given entry, more liberal entry as well. So a lot of the other reforms did happen. So there is something to be explained there, that how there's a difficult question for a writer to explain why is it that Narasimha Rao turned out to be a liberalizing prime minister, contrary to what you would have predicted, actually. And there's nothing in his past that you can fall back on, say that this is where he had been a liberalizing kind of prime minister. So, but the book then tries to make an effort, tries to explain why he did the liberalization. I'll leave that for you to read, but then I come back, last set of things in another 3 minutes or so. Sorry, the lecture has gotten a bit longer, but in 3 or 4 minutes, I'll wrap it up now. The impact of socialism on us remains in a number of different ways. First of all, reforms have been very slow. If you compare what happened in China, Deng Xiaoping came along. He also faced some internal opposition, but he could quickly change. We were working within a democratic setup in which the socialist thought had really become dominant. Change became much harder. Not so in China, authoritarian. Top leadership changes mind, changes the system entirely. We are still struggling 30 years later. And labor laws, for example, still have not been changed. Land laws in the states are still, urban land is incredibly expensive as a result. Number of things. Public sector is still very large. By early 1980s, about 80% of the 80% of the paid up capital had moved into the public sector. So a lot of very large public sector was inherited by Narasimha Rao also. But look how little privatization we have been able to do. The whole process, this sharing. The government today, for example, has a clear policy, the public enterprise policy, where it has publicly, it is in that policy stated that we are going to keep public enterprises only in 4 strategic sectors: defense, banking, and 2 more, railways, or maybe there's 1 more. So, but the rest we will not. This was a policy that was actually announced in 2020 or 21, but hardly any privatization has happened. You can see how slow the process has been. Now, that is one aspect, which is, and today, if I look for a single economist who is trained largely and nurtured here, who is passionate advocate of liberalization, it's very difficult to find some. I mean, we have maybe one here, but very rare, actually, very rare. Homegrown. I'm talking homegrown. A lot of us who wrote about it, we actually got our education in the US. If you go to whoever contributed from within the government, Vijay Kelkar, before that, Abid Hussain, Monting Singh Anwalia, Rakesh Mohan, Shankaracharya, etc. These are all people who had been basically exposed to the United States, either through their studies or having worked there. Still, particularly therefore, among the intellectuals, the economists who do most of the teaching in the Indian colleges still are very much teaching the old socialist economics. I think we have made some progress. I don't want to completely say that no progress has been made. Obviously, progress has been made. I'm sure 20 years ago, CDS would not invite me to give this lecture. Absolutely, there is no doubt to that. Or for that matter, any other institution, I think, within India, we were not welcome, especially at the time. So progress has been made, but still it's very gradual. Now, one last area where this has continued is that the structure of the economy has still remained, in spirit at least, if not completely formed, what it was under Nehru. What are our successful industries? Petroleum refining, machinery industry, pharmaceutical industry, you got IT industry, you got finance industry. These are all either highly capital intensive industries or highly skilled labor intensive industries. Labor intensive industries are still not making a success in India. The structure of the industry still remained. This is another aspect to this development process where we have not been able to really rejig our system in the way China was very quickly able to do, or all the other developing countries which have succeeded were able to do, which is the fact that ultimately you look at any country which is a developed country, take the United States, you got production, they basically economic activity is located on the East Coast and a little bit on the West Coast. You go to Japan, Tokyo. You go to Korea, you got Seoul. It's largely along the coast. And that's where the population concentrates. Look at China. 2/3 of China is empty. About hardly 5 or 6% of the population lives in West and North. Virtually all about 90% plus population is on South and Eastern coast. This economic activity successfully concentrates. What we have tried to do always is to diversify. And also because we were self-sufficiency driven, all our economic activity was located forcefully inland and then spread out to the country. That, that when the government will give licenses or government will set up public sector enterprises, it will distribute something to Bihar, something to UP, something to Kerala, something to Tamil Nadu, something to Gujarat, something. That, of course, leads to loss of the agglomeration economies of scale that are essential for rapid expansion of output, rapid expansion of growth. So today, a lot of the manufacturing activity is happening inland, but the infrastructure is not connecting to the ports. We are still working on it. That's work in progress. I mean, all these industrial corridors, etc., they're being built and now being brought to the port. This morning, we visited the port 10 kilometers down south from here. And you ask the question, why is it happening finally in 2024? I mean, this is the first port with the depth of 20 to 22 meters. India has no port which has that kind of depth, but that depth had existed for thousands of years. Finally, we are building that port here, little south of Thiruvananthapuram. Why? That should have happened. But this is the, and even then, when that port gets built up, well, it's already operational and it will increase its capacity over the next 3 or 4 years to about 3 million TUEs. But the point still is this port fully connected internally with the manufacturing hubs? Or is there manufacturing happening along the coast itself? I mean, a lot of the Chinese manufacturing happened along the coast so that you bring in raw materials and intermediate inputs, assemble them, do the processing, and export them back. But that's not what is happening here. So this sort of, in a variety of ways, what we did during that era, during the Nehru era, still remains with us. One last thought. This is where the book kind of concludes. At last chapter, chapter 15, I asked this provocative question that, suppose the life profiles, age profiles of Sardar Patel and Nehru had been reversed, so that Patel was the younger one and Nehru was the older one, and so Nehru would have been the one to be taken from the scene in December 1950, and Patel would have been the one to survive till May 1964. What would the system have been like? So I read a lot of the speeches of Patel, which is, his writings are not very much there, but you can glean a few things from Patel's speeches. And certainly, public sector would not have been so central or at all there. Patel was not. Patel very much believed in private enterprise. Yet probably we wouldn't have had that much heavy industry either. He certainly had no passion for it. He may have not been opposed. So some heavy industry may have happened, but largely not so. Self-sufficiency, I think on trade, it is difficult to say because I don't find enough writings of him. But if we can't do it here, is this connected to the internet? Okay, then we can play this. I just want to play this little clip for you. Okay. Well, I think we went somewhere else. It didn't quite play. So, like, there's a very nice clip actually of an interview of J.R.D. Tata. And he says this exactly the same. I mean, and I didn't know of this clip till after the book had already come out. But he basically says this, that, think about it, if Patel was the younger one and Nehru the older one, we would have had a totally different system. There wouldn't have been any public sector, etc. So at least there's some corroboration from somebody who knew both Nehru and Patel. I mean, J.R.D. Tata was actually one of the authors of the Bombay Plan of 1944. So he was very much there and knew both of them. And certainly I was very pleased to see that clip where he exactly corroborates what the last chapter of my book says, that perhaps, but that's just a provocative kind of ending to the book. Obviously, that was a pure hypothetical, but in terms of what actually existed, really the running theme of my book is that pretty much once Nehru had put that system in place, we were on a largely deterministic path. There was no easy way to get away from it. And that I substantiate by showing that, look, whenever the system tried to move away from it, it's failed to move away. I mentioned the 1969 struggle between conservatives and Indira Gandhi, then Morarji Desai coming to the helm, nothing changing, Rajiv Gandhi trying, nothing changing, 91. And subsequently also, change is very slow. And that, I think, influence of the socialistic policies continues to be with us. So that's okay. So I'm concluded. If you see, if you can, then we can do it. But
Thank you, sir, for that very comprehensive and elaborate discussion about Nehru model and how the early thinking and ideas influences even today in terms of shaping our policies and economic outcomes. So one good thing is that in India, in democracies, changes happen very slowly, as clear, as clearly.
I think this is it. Yes, yeah.
You can.
The volume थोड़ा down कर देंगे.
Suppose that Vallabha had been the young man and Nehru would be the older man. And Vallabha would have been, obviously would have become the Prime Minister of India. Certainly the economic plan, there would have been a totally different situation than the one that exists today.
You frequently disagreed with Pandit Nehru. When you articulated or shared those disagreements, what was his response?
I tried. He liked me, I loved him, admired him.
Where did you
But when you, on this kind of thing,
bring that back?
economics, which of which you very little, in my opinion, and certainly on socialism and how socialism could be established without the loss of economic freedom for the majority of the people. Anyway, to be careful what I say. Repeat your question.
When you spoke to Jawaharlal Nehru and
I
articulated your disagreements in economic policy, what
Well,
was
the
the
reaction
reaction?
was very simple. No, I tell you what the reaction was. I thought I'd mentioned somewhere. I'd go and see him. Sometimes he'd invite me even to have a meal and when to see the giant panda that he had. And then I would try to bring the conversation to economics, nationalization, bureaucracy. He was not only not interested, but he wasn't willing even to talk. And he had invented a little trick. Was that when I started, we sat very near each other, and there was a window not too far. The moment I began to edit, he turned around and looked out of the window. And I got the message.
Most people think building a personality means wearing expensive watch and carrying branded outfit.
Okay, so this is a very comprehensive lecture covering all aspects of Indian economy, which generally we cover one full course is being discussed in 1 hour, covering all aspects on the policies and how it impacted Indian economy, and also the long run impact of the earlier policies and how Nehru's initial ideas and model has been shaping the thinking even today and the outcomes. One good thing which is implicit in the lecture, however, is that even though the changes happen very slowly, typically in democracies, unlike in countries like China. So in the Indian case, we can see that these changes happened very slowly, almost 5 decades or so. But then once the change happened, there is no tendency to kind of reverse. So that we can see in the Indian context after post-1991, even when left parties were part of the central government, they didn't really go back to the earlier control regime. They also, even though not in a major way, they also kind of continued with the same type of reform process by and large. So that is a good thing. Now we see that there are this process is going on, but the big thing that we need to think now, which I want to ask sir, is that from the central government's perspective, reforms are going on, even though somewhat slowly, but the main part is in the purview of the state government, like, particularly labor market, agriculture, education, health. These are the important areas, particularly those related to factor market, even though the product market reforms have been undertaken by and large by the central government, unless we change the factor market, and that comes largely in the purview of the government. The labor, of course, is in the concurrent list, but the states also can play an important role. But this is the area where nothing has happened. Not many major reforms have not happened. Agriculture is the way it is, like it used to be earlier, no major reforms. Education, we are talking about a new education policy, but again, there is no kind of guarantee that the states all will adopt that. Health is again in a very bad shape in terms of reforms. Labor market, yes, some states have undertaken, but there is no kind of consensus. So do you think that there is something, some hope there that the states will get into this reform process? And what is that the way out for incentivizing states to undertaking these reforms? So I just ask this question and then take, maybe you can take, respond to this later. We can take more questions. Sir, you want to? Yeah, yes.
Seems we all know that the sort of labor intensive factory production is yet to, I think you already mentioned, is yet to pick up in a large, even after 3 decades of what will be the limited economic growth. And if you take state governments, which Bhagwati has just mentioned, quite a lot of state governments have no socialist background. So what can be the sort of, can we really connect the sort of slow pace of development of I would call labor intensive factory production, or the low willingness to go ahead with the reforms by a number of state governments? Can we connect this to the socialist model of development? Or are there some other material objective conditions preventing governments or preventing entrepreneurs to go ahead with that, or sort of, I would call, enhancing the labor intensive factory production? Are there some other factors at play? Can we simply connect this to the socialist model, which is still operating in the minds of intellectuals and bureaucrats? Or are there some material conditions still playing an important role? Is that when we look at the investment strategy, heavy industry and but now when it comes to another important aspect of investment in education, that is when you look at the history of China and other countries, they heavily invested in primary education and then slowly moved up to higher education. But in the well, in the case of India, I think we are not given enough attention to education, and it is already not in the allocation of the first 5 year plan, that is education, and our investment patterns is also not powerful, especially primary and secondary. How, if you see any reason behind this kind of education, investment in education, totally the ideology.
Let's take this first.
Yeah.
So we'll take rounds of 3. So these are all connected, and these are all questions are connected. So I'll try to bring that up quickly. Now, let me pick first the last one. First of all, how did the Nehru model actually impact the primary education? So here's a dramatic factoid for you. During the second 5-year plan, now, well, the background to the factoid is that it was a very poor country. Incomes are incredibly low. Savings rate was about 7%. So whatever investable resources were available were very meager. You put them into steel mills. Steel mills also required engineers and managers. So we went after IITs and we went after the IIMs. And now the result of that was that you had hardly anything left to invest in primary education. The factoid is that during the second 5-year plan, the expenditure on the development expenditure on primary education was half of what had been invested in one steel mill during that 5-year plan. That is how little you could invest. There was no money left. When you go in for the heavy industry, you know how much investable resources you are required. And then also whatever was invested in education went to engineering colleges and the management schools. So it impacted that also. Now, is that still relevant now? That somehow the lack of investment in school education is the reason why the manufacturing is not doing so well. This is an argument often made, but I just don't see. I mean, there are plenty of high school pass students, male and female, who would love to get these factory jobs. What we are lacking are the factories. Question is, why are the factories not coming up? That comes back to the issue you raised. I think this mindset, I mean, I still contend that two things. One is that what has happened in the past, everything creates its vested interests. And the vested interests that the system that have been created are simply not very friendly to bringing up the labor intensive factories. Who you tell me, either in the states or the central government, is really passionately pitching for labor intensive manufacturing factories. The passion is for doing things for farmers. Passion is for doing for MSMEs. That's where the passion is. And I can see politically, of course, that makes perfect sense, because 45% of the workforce is in agriculture. Another 40 to 45 is in enterprises which have less than 20 workers. In fact, about almost 40% is in enterprises which have less than 10 workers. They're very tiny. When we say MSME, there is no medium there. It's supposed to be micro, small, and medium. It's only micro and small. There are hardly any medium. Medium are checked out, and large are a few. Just 7 or 8% of the workforce is in large enterprises, the corporations. That is all. So you see, there is no constituency there for large scale manufacturing in labor intensive products. You go to CII, you go to FICCI, ask them how many of them are in apparel manufacturing or footwear manufacturing or furniture manufacturing. Not a single hand will go up. I actually, when I go to speak at CII, I tease them. I ask them, okay, how many of you know who is Harish Ahuja? Obviously, they think I am coming from Mars. You know, why am I asking about Harish Ahuja? Harish Ahuja is India's largest apparel manufacturer, accounting for about 7% of India's apparel exports. But even, you know, but he gets no currency whatsoever at the CII or FICCI. He's never invited to anything. How many times either any state government has invited to ask him, you know, what should we do? I mean, I am the one who is trying to connect him to the state governments. You know, now that as a part of my current job, I've been going to different states. So I connected him to the Gujarat government, for example. You know, they were saying that, oh, you know, they showed some interest in labor-intensive manufacturing. So I think last 2 or 3 years, I'm hearing this, at least on the social media, etc. There's a lot of chatter, at least, about labor-intensive manufacturing. So that's a good thing. I think so. It's creating some kind of awareness about the importance of labor-intensive manufacturing. But otherwise, you don't see that. So on the state side, of course, you know, I think what the states labor, by the way, still first set of reforms still have to come from the central government. The 4 labor codes, as they have been actually enacted already by the parliament, need to be implemented, meaning they need to be notified. I hope they will be notified, you know, now. I suspect that the government has been waiting because of all the elections that were happening. More or less, they are not done. Hopefully, they will be notified. I think that will be a very important step in the right direction. On land, I think it is the states. So once the central laws actually get implemented, then states will need to do things. But those laws, the way they are written, states can do quite a lot. It empowers the states. For example, that Industrial Disputes Act provision on hiring and firing. The new code on industrial relations actually tells the states that they can change this limit. It's the new code sets a limit of 300 workers Anybody with 300 or fewer workers can hire and fire at will. But it also empowers every state that by through a simple notification, they can raise that 300 limit to 30,000 if they want, whatever they want, they can do it. So that sort of flexibility has been introduced in those, but first this has to happen. But land is where the states need to work. I think urban land is incredibly expensive in India. There are many things that states need to do. The whole process of urbanization is completely stalled when it comes to for example, urban housing. We seem to focus only on giving houses to the urban poor. We forget that what is much more important is the cheap, low rent housing, cheap rental housing, and dormitory kind, because in the factories, basically, initially the workers come as migrants. They want to work there, work hard. They don't bring their families. They live there, whether it's men or women. Basically, they, and I visited during this, we were in Tamil Nadu. Some very good, those Foxconn factories, etc., that are being built along the coast. Very good urban rental housing, where the large room, 6 beds, and the facilities provided, shared facilities among the 6. And that's what they need. 2,000, 2,500 rupees per month, each of them pays the rent. And the model is good, actually, they will recover through this rental payment, whatever the state has invested in it and whatever private partner has invested. So that sort of thing is what one needs, because land is so expensive in India, in our urban land, that commercial rental housing is unaffordable. Rental yields are about 3%, 2%. Interest rate is 6%, 7%, 8%, probably even 10%. It's not viable. So land prices have to come down. There's a bunch of things that the states need to do. I don't see that, they're doing. By the way, I disagreed with your statement that that there is no baggage in the states, the socialist baggage. No, not Kerala. Any state you live, because most of the parties have actually come out of the Congress party. Only BJP had existed separately as Jan Sangh. But BJP also has had, for example, the Deen Dayal Upadhyaya. He was a socialist. He's one of their icons. Deen Dayal Upadhyaya was also a socialist. So every party does have. Actually, the party which wanted to shed socialist baggage or had really was anti-socialism was the Swatantra Party, which disappeared, which didn't survive, which also tells you how strong the hold of socialism is on, there's one single party which really tried to be a market party, pro-market party, got wiped out completely.
Just one factual information. I think if you take just one factual information, I don't want to take too much of your time. If you take the share of the students, youngsters, who go for higher education, out of those who complete school education successfully, it is very high. It could be something like 60 to 70%, 80%. That means actually, and then you have the low female participation rate. If you combine these two, the share of the population which is actually willing to do factory work in India is substantially lower than many other countries.
It doesn't matter. At this point, only question I have to ask is that if I want factory workers, do I have the supply of those workers? Plenty of them. I mean, Foxconn has no shortage of workers. The women are basically, very dominant part of the workforce of Foxconn and other factories, because we visited very recently in Tamil Nadu. You provide that, basically, you have to provide security for women. That's absolutely essential. And if they are not living on the factory premises, then you also need the transportation for them. But which is what China always does, one or the other. And it's the same model, and you do them. They have no shortage of workers. Where we create a problem, policy-wise, states, is by raising the minimum wage. Harish Ahuja, actually, last time I wrote in Times of India was about 3 or 4 months ago. He wrote back and said, thank me, but then he said, I had taken these factories to Odisha, which was, generally, they can't operate in tier 1 cities because the cost of living is so high that they can't pay the wages. They immediately become uncompetitive. So they have to go to tier 2, tier 3 cities where they can pay wages of about 15,000 rupees per month, which is decent wage. But at 15,000 in Delhi or Bombay, you can't survive. So obviously he can't. So he does that. He took the factories to Odisha. And lo and behold, Odisha raised the minimum wage by 30%. So he said, my labor costs are 30% and 30% increase in minimum wage. That's a 9% increase my cost. I'm wiped out. So he said, no, I will have to break my companies into MSMEs, that each factory I have to break up into 4, because the government only wants to give incentives, also all incentives, some interest rate subvention, whatever else, whatever incentives are given are to the MSMEs. And he said, I don't get any of this. So I have to probably break my factories into small ones. Now, you're trying to raise the scale of these factories, but policy is trying to push you into the other direction. And when the largest manufacturer of apparel in your country says that I have to now think about breaking up my factories into small ones so that I qualify for MSME status, I think that tells you something.
Any questions?
Thank you for the lecture, sir. Bit of digression from what we discussed now. So India is the only country that made a transition to industrialization and modernization with democracy and sovereignty intact. So having said that, can we actually look at Nehru's economic project without intertwining it with the political project? Now that we have a benefit of hindsight, but at the time, Nehru inherited an India that had 30 years life expectancy, more than 80% illiteracy, wars going on, country divided on religious lines, and then he took on this project of creating a material base for the liberal democracy. So, my question is, in your opinion, what do you think? Did Nehru's political project succeed, as in your opinion, Nehru's economic project did not succeed as much as it should have?
If I understood your question correctly, I think the first place the book begins by putting the matter exactly that way. And I say that his political project was an unqualified success. There is no country, that maybe Costa Rica might be the exception, but otherwise a developing country which post Second World War started as a democracy and survived as a democracy for pretty much all 75 years. India is the only one. Not only is the largest democracy, but it is actually probably the only developing country democracy, aside of maybe I think Costa Rica, which is a very tiny little country in the backyard of the United States. But that was pretty much it. So, it is a huge success.
That would not have been possible, without the self-sufficiency that Nehru.
No. If you're saying that what his economic model was actually essential for the success of his political project, no, with that I disagree. With that I completely disagree. There was no need for it. Actually, the political project would have succeeded even more, because then the economic success would have been delivered much faster. I see no connection, easy way in which I can say that this economic model was essential for the success of the political project. No, I see no connection.
So in terms of the Nehru model's impact on labor-intensive manufacturing and its long-term impact on that sector, it's very clear. But in addition to that, as you said, it has also impact on other sectors. Like one is primary education. The focus was more on higher education starting from the beginning, and we see the impact of that happening even today. In terms of which industries we are specializing and have competitive advantage. These are all high skilled, not the labor intensive. The other one is about agriculture. You said that Nehru didn't have a specific focus on agriculture as such, but in terms of the impact of his policy, it had a huge impact, adverse impact on agriculture also, because as you said, there were no surplus resources available for this industrialization. Then agriculture was the milking cow, from where the savings could be used and then put it in investment in the public sector. That is one way. The other one is a protection to the manufacturing meant a disprotection to the agriculture, because also because of the the overvalued exchange rate, which created a bias against agriculture and light manufacturing industries. So both agriculture and the light manufacturing, the traditional industries, suffered indirectly. Because it meant a disprotection to those industries which were export oriented, and also you have to get the resources, extract the resources from agriculture to finance your investment in manufacturing.
So some surplus obviously was there, savings were being done. So I think, but those were relatively small amount of savings, which was all the more reason to invest them prudently where you would raise productivity quickly. Having said that, clearly you needed to have agricultural development. That became very clear actually, it didn't have become maybe clear enough while Nehru lived. But very soon after Nehru died, we had back-to-back two drought years. And there we were actually, Indira Gandhi ultimately having to practically, be subject to this what Lyndon Johnson used to call the ship-to-mouth policy, whereby, basically it's only when the starvation, India would be on the verge of starvation, he would release another ship of food grains, wheat from the United States. I mean, those are very sad stories. And in one of my books, I quote, how Indira Gandhi, when talking to Lyndon Johnson, would really be, on the phone, be so edgy that she told her advisors that I never again in life I want to have this kind of crisis ever again and deal with this man, Lyndon Johnson. So, I mean, clearly, even in terms of the entire morale of the country, before that, you might know Lal Bahadur Shastri preceded Indira Gandhi as the prime minister, and he at one time had to actually, because he was the prime minister when these back-to-back droughts happened, and he had to actually call on the entire nation to have a fast on 1 day per week on Mondays, that eat only once a day. That's how acute the food shortage became. So quite apart from the surplus issue, agriculture became a huge problem for India, because at the end, and this is why, I mean, it is the memory of that period that no politician in India would ever touch agriculture in the sense of, today, opening it to competition or anything like that. That look, I mean, this is seen in India as a national defense issue, that you've got to be self-sufficient in agriculture. So it really is impact of that. So so clearly agriculture should have been the first. It should have been, and there were, by the way, some advocates of that. Bombay School, as it is called, Vakil and Brahmanand, they did pitch for what came to be called the wage good model. So that is all discussed in the book, so agriculture was crucial, and you had to do that. But even without it, actually, the investment policy, we got it wrong, actually. There's also the exchange rate issues, which I talk about a bit. 1957, we should have devalued. It was not fantastic nonsense of any kind, actually. But anyway, there was no support for devaluation among the intellectuals either. Nobody was supporting it except B.R. Shenoy.
We are imagining about India attaining the level of development compared to the all advanced countries. But at the same time, something is very when you say we know that globalization and privatization results in inequality, income inequality. So that's what is happening across the capitalist countries as well as Indian countries. Poverty was very less, but we are coming out of poverty. Poverty is reducing over time, but inequality at the same time it's increasing. That's one thing. But at the same time, what is happening? Unemployment is also increasing. So it is.
What is increased?
Unemployment is increasing.
Unemployment.
So that is, I think there is a challenge because we are talking about actually India being developed. At the same time, unemployment is increasing. So it's because of one of the things is there is a lot of skill gap. But market wants, and there is no skill, there is no presence of skill. So it's a whose responsibility, whose responsibility should be to target. Although actually Indian government is actually launching a lot of policy is like yes programs like skilling and reskilling. So all those things are there. But I think actually still because with privatization is not ready to absorb actually employment. So whose responsibility ultimately? How actually India can read the demographic dividends. So by employing its people.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So let me ask you, the knowledge that suddenly there is this, these billionaires, have you lost your sleep on account of that? Have you? No, right? I mean, but if your colleagues actually, if you have a colleague whose salary is doubled and yours is not, would you lose sleep or not? Yeah. So let me answer. So really we make a little too much of inequality. If poverty is being reduced and the poor are being brought up, misery is being put an end to. It's arguable whether inequality is rising or not. I'm willing to accept. I think that there are a lot of billionaires and also therefore some form of inequality is rising. Now, the way we intellectually kind of represent inequality is very different than the inequality that matters to the people. People react to inequality in their immediate social context, which is why I asked you, do you lose your sleep when your colleague's salary is doubled and yours is not? I think it's the immediate social context that matters. When people say, "Aare, itna billionaire ho gaye," and all, I mean, ask them that if we send all those billionaires, force all those billionaires to migrate to America or to Dubai or somewhere else, will they sleep better? I need not, try to answer that question. So that's my answer to your inequality question. It'll be nicer, of course, if everybody has the same income and we have this ideal world out there. But that's not life. Your choices are between poverty and nobody being rich versus some people being rich and less poverty. I will take the second. Now on unemployment, I think again, unemployment is not India's problem. If you look at, now we are doing good surveys on the PLFS. You'll see that if anything, actually employment rate has been gradually declining. It's very low anyway. India's problem is having underemployment. People are employed well below their potential productivity. And this goes back to the, factory production and all that we talked about. That is where we have failed. A lot of the, when you, in the data, you see a bit of a larger rate of unemployment among particularly urban youth. And that I think has a lot to do with the fact that today, with incomes having risen, they have a lot of family support. So they are all interested in getting a Sarkari job if they can. But if they don't, then for a while they keep trying. So they, in the data, do come across as unemployed. But it's a choice being made that I don't want to take a job yet. But once you get to 27, 28 and all and see that the reality, if you face, you start taking the employment. And there the unemployment rates do decline actually. That doesn't answer the question of low productivity employment, which is what is characterizing. I mean, there's no reason why our per capita income should be $3,000. I mean, if today Korea has an income of about $30,000 to $35,000, China has an income of $13,000 to $15,000. Why should we have 3,000? Obviously, technology exists. It's a matter of getting the technology, which again, and getting the right machines. I mean, basically, what is the difference here? It's not so much of the skill difference. It's the having those machines and having the technologies is embodied in the machines. if we could work. Certainly, you can argue that we haven't acquired the kinds of skills but those skills will come with the factory. Ultimately, the skill will form while working in factory. I talked to, again, my friend Harish Ahuja. He says that, look, if I have somebody who is 5th or 6th grade education, I can train them in about 6 weeks for his apparel clothing manufacturing. So it's not, in a many of these employments, the skill impartation is not very complex, very complicated. And people who can actually acquire those skills, plenty of them exist. I mean, this factory, the Foxconn that we went, these young ladies that they were employing largely were 8th grade or 9th grade education, that's all. But they have to be motivated to and they get motivated if they're getting good wages, they get motivated. So that's very.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for that very thought-provoking and very comprehensive discussion. I learned a lot. I hope everyone all learned a lot. And in CDS, we have been always interested in policy-relevant issues related to Indian economy. There is a lot of interest. Many of our PhDs are related to these. And I just wanted to say this because just 2 days back, I attended finance minister's interactive meeting with economists. 11 economists were called and 3 out of 11 are CDS PhDs. So that shows our interest in national policy related issues. And this is very much part of that type of our interest. And we all learned a lot. And thank you so much. Thank you all for attending this.
We have come to the end of the 13th Foundation Day lecture of CDS. We all had a great session which provided us with various insights of the Nehru era and its lasting impacts on the economy. I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Arvind Panagariya for taking out his valuable time and joining us and for the very insightful session. I express my gratitude to Dr. A. Jayatilak for joining us on this auspicious occasion. I would also like to thank our director, Professor Veeramani, for being the chair of this session. Last but not the least, I extend my gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us. All of you are invited to join us for the refreshments outside the hall. Thank you.